They are not just stones, they are a question pressed into the desert: who really built the pyramids? The short, evidence-backed answer that most Egyptologists give is simple on paper and enormous in implication. The Great Pyramid at Giza is usually attributed to Pharaoh Khufu and was raised by organized teams of Egyptian workers whose lives, records, and settlements are increasingly visible in the archaeological record, not anonymous alien engineers or a slave army. That attribution is underpinned by multiple lines of material evidence: the Wadi al-Jarf papyri, the so-called Diary of Mir, recovered by Pierre Tallet, describe organized shipments of Tura limestone to Giza and explicitly connect work crews to the reign of Khufu. Large-scale fieldwork by Mark Lehner's AERA project has revealed a substantial, long-term settlement, Heit el-Ghurab and related complexes, with bakeries, barracks and harbor infrastructure consistent with a skilled, state-organized workforce, and modern scanning projects, ScanPyramids and follow-ups, have revealed previously unknown internal voids and construction features that complicate simple ramps-only models and point to a sophisticated, evolving engineering program. In households that live in the shadow of Giza today, the pyramids are not ancient abstractions but family landmarks. Elders still tell stories, sometimes claiming ancestors helped build the great stones, or that mysterious keeps in the desert belonged to old royal crews. Oral threads that archaeologists have sought to compare with material finds. Excavators working at the workers' cemetery and village have recorded funerary markers, tools and tomb inscriptions that suggest respect and provisioning for builders rather than wholesale enslavement, supporting a picture of seasonal or state-levied labor, paid rations, and specialists, bakers, boatmen, draftsmen, rotated into the project. These ethnographic and excavation narratives helped shift scholarship away from the old Herodotian image of 100,000 conscripted slaves toward models of organized, paid labor working in shifts and housed in purpose-built settlements. If this is the starting consensus, it immediately opens a cluster of hard, testable questions that this story will follow. How did state logistics actually move millions of dressed and undressed stones from quarry to platform? What do the Mirror logbooks actually tell us about seasonal labor and the Nile's role? Which engineering solutions, temporary harbors, canals, sleds, lubricated paths, internal relieving chambers or counterweights, can be demonstrated archaeologically versus which remain plausible hypotheses? And finally, where do the remaining tensions and unexplained features, hidden voids, unusual quarry marks, and intermittent inscriptional evidence, leave room for revision or radical new interpretations? Those are the precise, verifiable threads we will trace next, weighing primary finds and peer-reviewed analysis against popular myths and weaker claims. They are not just stones, they are a question pressed into the desert: who really built the pyramids? In the dry heat that still clings to the Giza plateau, the question arrives as both archaeological problem and human story. Cargo lists inked on papyrus, rows of simple worker houses half buried in sand, and the strange, modern quiet when particle detectors reveal a cavern where none was expected. Each of these is a breadcrumb leading toward an evidence-first answer. In 2013, a French mission led by Pierre Tallet uncovered papyrus logbooks at the Red Sea port complex of Wadi al-Jarf. The best-preserved rolls, known as the Diary of Mir, record boat crews hauling Tura limestone and provisioning operations that link maritime logistics directly to the finishing phases of the Great Pyramid at Giza. Hard archival anchors that push the story away from fantasy and toward organized state enterprise. Excavations led by Mark Lehner and Ancient Egypt research associates at Heit el-Ghurab, the so-called lost city of the pyramid builders, have exposed planned barracks, bakeries and evidence of large-scale food preparation consistent with a long-term, state-supported workforce rather than a nameless slave mass. Faunal remains and provisioning patterns there point to meat, bread and beer as routine rations for those who served on the monuments. More recently, the ScanPyramids project used muon radiography to detect a major previously unknown void above Khufu's Grand Gallery, an internal feature confirmed by independent detector systems and published in Nature in 2017, showing that the monument's engineering still has surprises to teach us and that any complete story must accommodate both documentary logistics and complex internal architecture. Local legend: around Giza, elders still tell family tales. Some say their forebears helped raise the great stones. Others claim rivers carved by old hands once flowed nearer the plateau, and these oral threads, recorded by field journalists and ethnographers, align with the material picture of seasonal crews, boatmen, and skilled specialists who moved stone, food, and expertise across Nile channels and temporary canals. Taken together, these lines of evidence reframe the central questions the following narrative will test with sources. How did Old Kingdom administrators coordinate quarrying at Tura, shipping from the Nile and Red Sea, and on-site labor management at Giza? Which engineering methods, boats, canals, sleds, lubricated roadways, internal relieving chambers, or staged scaffolding, are demonstrable versus hypothetical? What does the worker settlement tell us about the social status, diet, and mobility of the labor force? And finally, what remaining anomalies, inscriptions, quarry marks, and the ScanPyramids' internal voids invite cautious, sourced hypotheses rather than leaps into myth? I will follow each of these threads through primary finds, excavation reports, and peer-reviewed studies, flagging speculation, giving credit to competing interpretations, and keeping the narrative rooted in what the evidence actually supports, so that when we answer, who really built the pyramids, we do so with archives, bones, buildings, and physics, not with invention. They are not just stones, they are a question pressed into the desert: who really built the pyramids? In the raw light of dawn on Giza, the story begins with paper and barley as much as with limestone. In 2013, archaeologist Pierre Tallet's team unearthed papyrus logbooks at the Red Sea harbor of Wadi al-Jarf, fragments now called the Diary of Mir. That record boat crews ferrying blocks from the Tura quarries and provisioning men in ships in a sequence that ties maritime logistics directly to work at Khufu's pyramid, shifting the debate from myth to managerial reality. Around the same years that those scrolls were being pieced together, systematic fieldwork led by Mark Lehner and Ancient Egypt Research Associates uncovered a sprawling, planned settlement near Giza, Heit el-Ghurab, whose bakeries, bakers' ovens, storage pits, and rows of simple but durable housing make sense only if thousands of people were provisioned, organized, and rotated as part of a state project rather than being an anonymous slave mass. Faunal remains and experimental archaeology on site have even reconstructed the daily staples, bread, beer, and salted meat, that sustained these crews. Modern physics has added an unexpected voice. The ScanPyramids collaboration used 3 independent muon detection technologies and published their findings in peer-review venues after detecting a substantial, previously unknown void above Khufu's Grand Gallery. An architectural surprise that demonstrates the Great Pyramid still yields empirical puzzles and that engineering explanations must account for both surface logistics and hidden internal design. Local legend, beyond the science, local oral memory threads through the modern town. Elders who live in the shadow of the monuments still tell family tales of forebears who worked with the stones, and of river courses and temporary canals that once threaded nearer the plateau. Stories collected by field workers and ethnographers that do not prove technical hypotheses but map how living memory and archaeology intersect at Giza. Taken together, these converging, verifiable lines, logistical papyri, the worker city archaeology, dietary and provisioning studies, and non-invasive imaging results, reshape the opening answer to our title. The pyramids were not hewn by extraterrestrial engineers nor by a single anonymous slave population, but by an organized, state-coordinated labor system whose material traces are now visible in paperwork, settlement archaeology, and even particle physics, yet each of those fields also leaves open technical questions about the precise methods, how blocks were moved from Tura down canals and Nile routes, how seasonal labor was levied, and what the newly detected internal voids actually represent. Questions this investigation will pursue strictly by source, not by speculation. The river ran like a hidden artery beneath the builders' lives. Boats, not chariots, threaded the landscape that made the pyramids possible, and the evidence for that aquatic choreography is tangible, archival, and surprisingly modern in its surprises. In the brittle light of the Wadi al-Jarf storage galleries, Pierre Tallet's team recovered the Diary of Mir, papyrus logbooks written in hieratic by a middle-ranking inspector who records day-to-day shipments of Tura limestone and the provisioning of boat crews during the reign of Khufu, a direct, contemporary administrative voice that names places, records seasons, and ties seacoast storage and Nile transport to work at Giza. These entries are widely published and translated in the IFAO volume of Talit's Papyri and make the logistical link explicit rather than speculative. At the same time, 21st-century field archaeology on the plateau has turned up a built landscape for work. Mark Lehner's decades-long AERA program has mapped and excavated Heit el-Ghurab, the so-called lost city/port, revealing structured barracks, bakeries, large storage pits and gallery complexes whose scale and organization fit a long-term, crown-directed provisioning system rather than an undifferentiated mass of enslaved laborers. Where graves and inscribed markers survive, they show individuals identified by craft and role, and cemetery contexts discovered and documented since the 1990s, work published by excavators and reported by major outlets, have been read by many Egyptologists as evidence for a workforce that was fed, housed, and managed under state systems. Modern science has not been content to read only ink and bones. The ScanPyramids project applied 3 independent muon detection techniques and reported a large internal void, the Big Void, above Khufu's Grand Gallery, a cavity whose minimum length was estimated at about 30 meters, demonstrating that the pyramid's internal architecture still contains major, empirically detectable features that require engineering explanations and caution against simplistic ramp-only models. These converging lines, administrative logbooks from Red Sea harbors, a Nile front urban/port complex at Giza, funerary clusters for workers, and particle physics imaging of hidden internal spaces, together force a reweighing of older assumptions and give us testable mechanics. Mirror's entries describe boats offloading Tura limestone and note seasonal timing that dovetails with the annual inundation and the idea that crews and materials moved along managed waterways. Lehner's port/canal hypothesis, supported by geomorphological cores, stratigraphic traces of paleochannels, and the mapped layout of basins east of the plateau, lays out how short canal basins and harbors could have brought stone and timber almost to the worksite. Laboratory experiments in granular physics published in Physical Review Letters in 2014 show that modest wetting of desert sand dramatically reduces sled friction, creating capillary bridges that stiffen the sand and reduce drag, giving a plausible, measurable mechanism for how large sledges could be hauled across prepared ramps or roadways with far fewer hands, and the archaeological record of provisioning, massive baking installations, animal processing debris, and concentrated food preparation architecture at Heit el-Ghurab and adjacent work zones, corroborates the administrative picture of large, rotating labor contingents receiving bread, beer, and meat as regular rations. Local legend, alongside this archaeological and scientific evidence, living memories and local oral traditions, recorded in interviews and reportage over decades, preserve lines that speak of forebears who worked the stones, and of river arms that once touched nearer the plateau. These narratives do not substitute for archival proof, but they map how communities understand their past and have helped direct archaeologists to testable features such as buried basins and sedimentary channels. Taken together, the most defensible reconstruction available today is sober and human. The pyramids were erected by an organized, state-administered labor system that moved quarried stone by boat and canal, hauled it on sleds across prepared paths, possibly wetted to reduce friction, housed and fed workers in purpose-built settlements, and employed evolving engineering solutions within the monuments themselves. And the evidence for each element rests in named documents, mapped architecture, geomorphological data, controlled physics experiments, and non-invasive imaging, not an anonymous myth. That said, important open questions remain as clear, empirical problems rather than invitations to grand speculation. The exact routes and engineering specs of the hypothesized canals and basins, where cores and remote sensing give conflicting or incomplete pictures, the full purpose and constructional history of the ScanPyramids' internal void, detected robustly but not yet accessible for direct study. The organizational details of labor rotation and payment, inscriptional references and provisioning records illuminate the system but leave gaps, and the chronology of how the port/harbor infrastructure shifted around the plateau during and after Khufu's reign. Each of these is currently the subject of peer-reviewed studies and field programs and must be addressed by further coring, targeted excavation, textual analysis, and non-invasive imaging rather than by amplification of unverified claims. Speculation, alternative theories that invoke lost global civilizations, advanced non-human builders, or mysterious esoteric technologies sit outside this evidence chain. They either rely on misread or out-of-context fragments, ignore the mirror papyri and the clear archaeological footprint of worker settlements, or fail to account for the physics and materials science demonstrated in controlled experiments and scans. Mainstream Egyptology therefore treats such hypotheses as speculative and unsupported by primary data. If you ask then, who really built the pyramids? The answer we can defend with sources is this: organized Egyptian administrations of the Old Kingdom, using river and coastal logistics, trained artisans and seasonal corvée or levied labor, practical engineering techniques, including water-assisted transport and sled hauling, and an evolving program of internal architecture, a complex of human planning, material knowledge, and institutional capacity whose traces are written in papyri dug in the ground and read out by muons, and each element of that reconstruction is documented in the publications of Pierre Taulet on the Wadi al-Jarf papyri, Mirror, Mark Lehner and AERA's Heit el-Ghurab reports, the ScanPyramids muon radiography paper in Nature, 2017, and follow-ups, the Physical Review Letter Study on Wet Sand and Sled Friction, 2014, and recent paleohydrological and geomorphological work on Nile waterscapes and paleo-channels that support canal hypotheses. The first sound you imagine is wood striking stone. At Hatnub, an eastern desert alabaster quarry whose faces still bear incised graffiti and quarry marks, the archaeology writes a ledger of extraction and haulage that stretches across centuries. Field surveys and epigraphic studies show names and expedition notations carved into the quarry walls. And archaeologists have documented an engineered ramp and road system that strongly implies sophisticated on-site solutions for moving huge blocks out of the rock face, proof that Old Kingdom teams engineered quarry-scale logistics as a matter of routine, not miracle. Local legend, local shepherds and Bedouin guides who still know the desert routes tell of ancient tracks and hard-packed ramps hidden under windblown sand, oral directions that have, in recent decades, helped archaeologists target the very exposures where the epigraphy survives. These inscriptions and the mapped ramp architecture at Hatnub confirm a basic, verifiable point. The ancient builders solved stone-moving problems at source with planned roads and hauling techniques long before the blocks reached the plateau. Here is the midpoint payoff, the concrete resolution of our logistics question with a different set of bones. The Khufu ship, excavated in 1954 by Kamal el-Malik and conserved as one of the oldest near-complete vessels ever recovered, is a physical, datable testament to the Nile-linked naval and woodworking capacity available to 4th Dynasty administrations. Its scale, over 40 meters long in reconstructed form, joinery, and seaworthiness show that Old Kingdom carpenters could assemble large, seaworthy or riverine craft, and that royal projects included purpose-built ships strong enough for heavy transport or ritual voyages. The ship itself was sealed in a pit beside the Great Pyramid and exhibited for decades at Giza before its transfer to the Grand Egyptian Museum, an archaeological fact that anchors maritime competence in the same complex that produced the Great Pyramid. Taken together with quarry ramps at Hatnub and experimental physics on wet sand, we can resolve one previously teased point. The ancient builders did not rely on a single universal technique. They combined local quarry engineering, riverine transport, and empirically effective hauling methods, including water-assisted sledging, into an integrated logistics system. That is not speculation, it is a synthesis of direct material evidence, inscribed quarry faces, an intact royal barque, and controlled laboratory results on sand friction, that answers how the culture had the technical means to move large stones from source to site. After that resolution, the narrative grows more human and slower. Imagine a winter dawn when line after line of barges sit low in a canal basin, men with woven sandals hauling ropes, bakers hauling trays of dough from Heit el-Ghurab's ovens, carvers smoothing the curve of an alabaster slab from Hatnub. The smell is yeast and hot stone, the sky is sand-gray, and the pulse of work follows the Nile's seasonal rhythm. In that picture the pyramids cease to be single-moment miracles and instead become the material outcome of repeated human cycles. quarrying expeditions that carved inscriptions into rock, naval crews that could assemble seagoing or riverine craft like the Khufu barque, and hauling teams that knew to wet and prepare sand to have the drag on a sled. Yet uncertainty remains and must be handled where it exists. While Hatnub inscriptions show quarry organization, they do not give step-by-step hauling blueprints for the largest pyramid blocks. The Khufu ship proves carpentry and transport capability but does not by itself prove every block was moved by water. And the wet sand experiments demonstrate a physical mechanism that would reduce effort but do not record who applied that trick or exactly when on the plateau. Those gaps are not invitations to myth but to specific, testable fieldwork. Sediment cores to reconstruct Paleocanal alignments at Giza, targeted excavation of ramp traces at Hatnub adjacent routes, and material analyses that tie ship timbers, rope fibbers, and sledge remains to particular workshops or seasonal provisioning roles. If you pull these threads together, inscribed quarry faces and ramps at Hatnub, an intact royal barque beside Khufu's pyramid, controlled physics showing how wet sand eases sled friction, and the map bakeries and magazines that fed workers, you arrive at a rigorous, evidence-first portrait. The pyramids were products of layered, interdisciplinary competence, quarry engineering, naval logistics, crowd organization and material science, deployed by an old kingdom state that left both ink and infrastructure behind. The remaining work is the careful kind, coring, targeted excavation, and laboratory matching of timbers, ropes and stone signatures to trace the precise routes and seasons that made those stones move. Until those projects complete, the best answer remains a human one rooted in named sites and dated finds, not in conjecture. The river was the builder's secret highway. Without the Nile's channels and the coastal harbors, the pyramids would have been a different kind of impossible. At the level of paperwork, the evidence becomes granular and ordinary. Mirus' logbook names the seasons, records trips to Tura to collect fine white limestone, lists the number of boats and men involved in particular stretches, and refers to officials, linking a named, dated administration to the movement of specific building materials. These are not later myths but contemporary administrative notes recovered from the Red Sea Harbor Complex. Pierre Tallet's publication and English translations make the entries available for scholarly inspection and show repeated circuit patterns between Tura, the Nile channels, and the harbor of Khufu. The human landscape on the plateau confirms that paper with mud and bone, excavations at the worker settlement, Heit el-Ghurab, and adjacent cemeteries reveal built bakeries, beer vats, magazines, bakers' ovens, and domestic debris consistent with mass provisioning. Graves show workers buried with food offerings and occasional marks of occupational injury, and tomb inscriptions identify craftsmen, overseers, and named teams, evidence that many of the pyramid workforce were organized, housed, and provisioned under royal control rather than being nameless enslaved masses. Mark Lehner and AERA's multi-season publications and public reports have laid out this material in detail. We can trace the stone's journey back to source. The Tura quarries, long known from texts and quarry archaeology, are explicitly named in Mirus entries as the source of casing stone. The high-grade limestone from Tura was prized for facing the pyramids, which matches petrographic studies linking casing fragments to that formation. Likewise, the hard granite used in internal chambers and sarcophagi traces to Aswan's quarries. The unfinished obelisk at Aswan and the visible working marks there provide direct, in situ evidence of how large monoliths were shaped at source before being riverborne to project sites. These distinct quarry landscapes, Tura for casing limestone, Aswan for granite, and the archaeological record of their exploitation confirm a multi-regional sourcing strategy for monument construction. The mechanics of moving the blocks have moved from speculation into experimental science. Laboratory work published in Physical Review Letters demonstrates that lightly wetting sand forms capillary bridges that stiffen the surface and can have the pulling force required on a sled, a measurable physical effect that directly supports the iconographic and textual evidence, for example, the Jehuti-Hotep tomb scene, showing a worker pouring water in front of a sledge. Combined with geomorphological evidence for short canal basins and harbors east of Giza, and with the Mira logbook's repeated boat movements, a coherent, testable logistics model emerges in which quarrying, riverine transport, local harboring, and prepared sled roads work together. Yet at the engineering frontier there are still stubborn unknowns. Non-invasive muon radiography, ScanPyramids, detected a large, big void above the Grand Gallery in 2017, a void whose minimum length was estimated in the discovery papers and press coverage but whose function and internal access remain undetermined because direct excavation is not possible without harming the monument. The discovery is robust, independent muon detector systems, multiple teams, but interpretive options remain open. Is the void a relieving corridor, a construction gap, or a deliberate internal chamber? ScanPyramids peer-reviewed and AR-14 papers report the detection while cautioning that the void's role is unresolved, leaving this as a focused empirical problem rather than a blank for speculation. Local legend: in villages around the plateau, the monuments are wrapped in family stories. Old men and women who grew up under the stones speak of ancestors who handled the great sails of wood, or kept watch at the canal mouth. Such oral histories, recorded in ethnographic interviews and magazine features, do not substitute for papyri or pottery, but they point scholars to local topography and sometimes to buried features later confirmed by cores or test trenches. These living memories have modest evidentiary weight but real heuristic value in shaping research questions and field targets. Speculation: some alternative accounts claim lost global civilizations, advanced non-human engineers, or hidden technologies as the only explanation for the pyramid scale. These hypotheses fail at the evidentiary threshold. They do not cite contemporary administrative records like Mirus logbook, they ignore quarry-level epigraphy and in situ tool marks at Hatnub and Aswan, and they bypass experimental mechanics that demonstrate plausible hauling techniques. In short, they replace chain of custody and testable mechanisms with assertion. Mainstream scholarship therefore treats such claims as speculative and unsupported by primary data, and a responsible narrative must present them only to refute them with named, peer-reviewed counter-evidence. The forensic path forward is practical and incremental: targeted coring to reconstruct paleocanal alignments, dendro or isotope matching of ship timbers to boatyards and river seasons, microscopic provenance studies linking casing fragments to particular Tura benches, and constrained, non-destructive imaging to clarify the ScanPyramids void. All projects that will tighten uncertainties without invoking the spectacular. These are the research steps that will turn remaining questions into measurable evidence. A single season unfurls like a ledger, dawns measured in oar strokes, cargo lists, and the steady smell of yeast from the ovens. This is how a building season at Khufu might be read if you stitch Mirus logbook to the worksite dirt and the bakehouses that fed the teams. In Mirus entries, the Diary of Mir, recovered at Wadi al-Jarf, a middle-ranking inspector records months of activity, summer months that many editors render as a July-November span, naming Tura as the quarry source for fine white casing stone, listing crews of boatmen, numbers around 40 are explicitly mentioned in the preserved fragments, and describing repeated circuits between the Red Sea storage galleries, Tura, and a harbor tied to Giza. The rhythm in those log lines is practical and administrative: 2 or 3 round trips every 10 days, the movement of dozens of blocks per trip, and remarks about provisioning and officials that anchor the work in a dated Khufu administration rather than in rumor. Imagine opening one of those papyri and counting courses of deliveries, boats arriving with dressed stone, log entries noting where the crew slept, which official met them, and when they returned to load again, paperwork that matches the cadence of seasonal labor and the Nile's timetable. At the river end, the plateau's archaeology furnishes the human complement to those lines. Heit el-Ghurab, the AERA, lost city, near Giza, reveals large-scale baking complexes, long magazines, ovens and waste deposits that indicate mass bread and beer production on a schedule consistent with feeding many hundreds or thousands of workers across months. Domestic debris, tool assemblages and cemetery evidence their mark occupational identities: bakers, carvers, boatmen, rather than a faceless slave. Mass, suggesting rotating labor contingents provisioned by the state on a seasonal cycle. Picture the route as a pipeline. At Tura, quarry teams cut and dress casing blocks, stone faces and quarry inscriptions attest to organized extraction, loaded them onto barges or river-capable boats. The material reality of large, well-made ships is attested in the Khufu barques sealed beside the Great Pyramid, piloted down managed canals or Nile channels toward the eastern basins of Giza, where short harbor basins and ramps, traces of which appear in geomorphological cores and sedimentary studies, allowed transfer to sledges and ramps. Experimental physics then enters the scene in the form of simple, reproducible mechanics. A lightly wetted path of sand can have sled pull by forming capillary bridges, a physical effect that explains the classic iconographic scene of a worker pouring water in front of a sledge and makes the hauling of multi-ton blocks across prepared roadways plausible without heroic, unrecorded manpower spikes. In the field season reconstruction, this all happens on a human clock. Men rise before the sun, bakers fire ovens through the night to supply loaves, boats are lashed and provisioned at Wadi al-Jarf or Tel Ras Badran, teams of rope pullers steady sledges across wetted tracks, and overseers, whose names and titles echo in merest rolls and in scattered inscriptions, log arrivals and departures so the next rotation knows when to expect supplies. Local legend: around modern Giza, elders recount family tales, grandfathers who took the stone to the canal, or watched barges moor at now vanished inlets. These oral fragments, while not primary administrative records, have directed researchers to testable topographic features and sometimes to places where coring confirms buried basins. Put plainly, when you read Mirror's administrative voice alongside AERA's bakeries and magazines and the naval evidence of large royal boats, and when you accept the controlled friction experiments that demonstrate how to move heavy loads over sand, a single building season becomes a coherent, sourced narrative of quarrying, riverborne transport, harboring, sledge hauling over wetted roads, and state provisioning. Each element documented in primary papyri, excavation reports, conserved ship timbers, sediment studies, and laboratory physics rather than left to myth. Dawn at the worksite smelled of yeast, resin, and hot stone, and the paperwork that survives tells us the rhythm. Mirror's logbook records repeated circuits from the Tura quarries to a harbor link to Giza, names a crew of about 40 boatmen, and times trips in a seasonal cadence that fits the Nile's rise and fall. Concrete administrative detail that ties named people and boats to the movement of casing stone rather than leaving the story to conjecture. At the edge of the plateau, archaeology matches that ledger with baked mud, fat, and bone. Heit el-Ghurab, the AERA workers' town, contains planned bakeries, large storage magazines, and concentrations of animal bone indicating large-scale provisioning. Faunal analyses and AERA reports argue that the site was a Crown-organized consumption center supplying bread, beer, and meat to rotating work crews, a model reinforced by long-term excavation reports and experimental archaeology on ancient baking and provisioning. Burials and memorials give those laborers dignity in the record. Tombs and cemeteries discovered in the Giza vicinity, published in excavation reports and public statements by Egyptian teams, contain formal interments with food offerings and inscribed labels that some excavators interpret as evidence the builders received honor and provision, not wholesale enslavement. These discoveries, first publicized in the 1990s, 2010s, shifted mainstream scholarship toward models of organized, state-managed labor that included specialists, seasonal contingents, and recognized craftsmen. Local legend: in villages that fringe the plateau, families still tell small, specific stories, grandfathers who watched barges unload, or relatives who kept the ovens at the site, and while these oral recollections are not administrative proof, ethnographic reporting shows they have helped archaeologists choose test locations for coring and trenching. Living memory thereby acts as a modest research cue rather than primary evidence. On the mechanics front, controlled science provides quantifiable mechanisms. Laboratory experiments published in physical review letters demonstrate that lightly wetting sand forms capillary bridges and reduces sliding friction, often by a large margin, offering an empirically grounded explanation for iconographic scenes depicting attendants pouring water in front of sledges and making large stone hauling across prepared tracks physically plausible without invoking vast, unrecorded workforces. Engineering explanations for vertical movement remain contested and evidence-driven. Mainstream Egyptological synthesis recognizes ramps, external straight, zigzag, or spiral, and levering techniques as plausible, testable methods. While Jean-Pierre Houdin's internal ramp hypothesis offers a detailed CAD model that some find technically interesting but which lacks decisive archaeological confirmation and meets pointed criticisms in peer discussion, comparative reviews and targeted studies, e.g. Rigby's assessment of ramp models, show that multiple ramp/leverage scenarios remain viable and that the archaeological record so far supports small, managed ramps and levering rather than a single massive, surviving ramp structure. At the pyramid's heart, modern muon imaging added an unexpected, non-textual witness. The ScanPyramids teams detected a large internal cavity, the Big Void, above the Grand Gallery using 3 independent muon methods and published the detection in peer venues. The void's existence is well supported by those measurements, but its purpose, relieving space, construction gap, or ritual corridor, remains unresolved because non-destructive imaging cannot yet substitute for direct access. Speculation claims that the pyramids required lost global civilizations, extraterrestrial builders, or secret non-documented technologies fail the evidentiary test. They do not reference contemporary administrative sources like mirror, ignore quarry-level inscriptions and in-situ tool marks, e.g., Hatnub and Aswan evidence, and bypass experimentally demonstrated mechanics. Wet sand friction, and the clear archaeological footprint of provisioning towns, mainstream scholarship therefore treats such proposals as unsupported speculation rather than defensible alternatives. If we stitch these lines of evidence into a working narrative, administrative logbooks that name places and crews, a built workers' town with bakeries and magazines, quarry inscriptions and ramps at source, demonstrable naval capacity, the Khufu barque, physical experiments that explain hauling, and non-invasive scans that reveal hidden internal architecture, the result is a human, testable account. The pyramids were built by an organized Old Kingdom state apparatus that combined quarry engineering, riverine logistics, skilled artisans and seasonal labor, and evolving inside and outside engineering solutions. The remaining tasks for archaeology are specific and practical: targeted coring to map paleocanals, dendros/isotopic matching of ship timbers, microscopic provenancing of casing stones, and careful non-destructive imaging to clarify internal voids, each step converting current uncertainties into measurable facts rather than into empty wonder. The bones speak as loudly as the papyri. Analyses of the Giza Workers' Cemetery and associated tombs, excavated and reported since the 1990s, reveal a community of skilled laborers, many buried with formal interments and food offerings, and skeletal markers that record repetitive heavy work and healed injuries consistent with long-term craft labor rather than expendable slave hordes. Field reports and syntheses by Leaner, Hawass and colleagues describe grave goods, named tomb owners identified as craftsmen or foremen, and osteological traces that allow scientists to reconstruct workload, diet and life expectancy within a managed labor population. At the quarries, the rock itself is a record. Sites such as Hatnub, Alabaster, and the Aswan quarry complex that includes the unfinished obelisk preserve incised expedition graffiti, tool marks, and engineered ramp cuts that document how teams removed and prepared massive blocks at source. Detailed epigraphic surveys and field reports, in March and Gurdon on Hatnub, excavation reports and studies at Aswan show named expedition marks, sketch graffiti and physical ramp traces, direct, in situ evidence that the ancient workforce solved extraction and near-quarry haulage problems with planned infrastructure before stones ever reached the Nile or the plateau. The paperwork ties the landscape together: the Wadi al-Jarf papyri, the Diary of Mir, published and translated by Pierre Tallet and colleagues, reads like a middle manager's ledger, naming routes to Tura, noting boat crews and officials, and recording repeated circuits that align with Nile seasonality. Those log entries, when combined with AERA's mapping of harbor basins and Heit el-Ghurab's provisioning architecture, permit a step-by-step reconstruction of seasonal rotations, boat-borne deliveries of casing stone, storage at coastal galleries, and scheduled transfers to plateau work gangs overseen by named administrators. Where engineering debates remain sharp, the literature is explicit about unresolved options: external, zigzag or spiral ramps, levering systems and internal ramp models. The Jean-Pierre Houdin hypothesis, each have technical merit and critique. Rigby's ramp model assessments and broader reviews argue multiple ramp/leverage strategies remain plausible, while Howden's internal ramp idea gains attention but lacks decisive archaeological confirmation, and modern non-invasive imaging adds new constraints and puzzles. ScanPyramids muon radiography securely detected a large, big void above the Grand Gallery in 2017, with follow-up characterization published more recently. So the correct synthesis today is not a single settled mechanism but a constrained set of testable engineering ensembles that archaeology and physics must continue to probe. Local legend: in villages that fringe the plateau, living memory stitches quieter vignettes into the scientific ledger. Grandparents who point to a long-vanished inlet and say, "The barges came here." Or families that recall an ancestor who kept the ovens. Oral fragments that lack the force of papyri but have repeatedly guided field teams to testable topography in buried basins. Ethnographic reportage shows these memories as research cues rather than substitutes for material proof. If you accept this evidence-weighted weave, skeletons and tombs that mark skilled communities, quarry faces that bear the scratch of organized extraction, a named inspector's logbook that records direct movements of Tura stone, the Khufu barque and similar ships that demonstrate naval capacity, physics experiments that show how a wetted track reduces drag, and particle detectors that reveal hidden internal architecture. Then the most defensible conclusion is not sensational but human. The pyramids were the product of an old kingdom administrative and technical system that combined regional quarrying, Nile and coastal logistics, organized provisioning, skilled craftwork, and evolving engineering solutions. The remaining mysteries are empirical field problems, routes, ramp geometries, the function of internal voids and precise labor accounting, that invite focused excavation, coring, provenance science and more non-invasive imaging rather than grand myth. They push off before dawn, 40 men on a string of boats under a sky still blue-black, the oars whispering while a low fire stokes the bakery ash back at the harbor. And the ledger they leave behind reads like a manager's to-do list rather than a myth. Mirror, an inspector recorded in the Wadi al-Jarf papyri and usually dated to the 26th year of Khufu's reign, writes in terse hieratic entries about repeated circuits from coastal storage galleries to Tura and back, naming destinations, crews, and the cadence of trips. Those fragments specifically link boat teams, seasonal timing and the movement of fine casing limestone toward Giza, so a single season can be read as alternating stretches of quarry work, coastal stowage, and riverine delivery, rather than as one-off miraculous hauls. Day 1, dawn at Tura. A team completes dressing a set of casing blocks. Quarry graffiti and the documented quarry processes at Tura show organized extraction and dressing of high-quality white limestone for facing, so the season opens with stones prepared at source and scheduled for barge loading. Day 3, harbor boats from Mirror's log tie up at a coastal gallery where stores of rope and salted meat are kept. Archaeological work at Red Sea storage sites corroborates the existence of purpose-built facilities for long-distance transport. Day 5, river transit crews steer down managed Nile channels or short canals. Geomorphological cores and mapped paleobasins east of the plateau provide physical grounds for these features, timing movements to the rising Nile so heavy cargo rides high water as far inland as possible. At each transfer point, overseers mark arrival and departure in the log. The administrative voice and the map landscape together create a pipeline of stone, provision and manpower that repeats on a seasonal clock. Local legend: mid-season, an elder in a canal-side village recalls how his grandfather helped line the barges, and how the inlet used to lie closer to the sand. These oral fragments, collected in ethnographic reportage, guided coring teams to subsurface silts that indeed revealed buried channels. Living memory here functions as a directional clue rather than proof, and where local leads align with cores and sediments, they strengthen the season's reconstructed route. Mechanics are not left to legend. At the worksite, men mount sledges and spread water along the track because a measurable physical effect explains that scene. Laboratory experiments published in physical review letters show that adding a small amount of water to sand creates capillary bridges that increase the sand's stiffness and can reduce sled pull forces substantially. Combined with iconographic evidence and the practicalities recorded in Mirror's itinerary, This gives a reproducible mechanism for moving heavy dressed stones across short prepared ramps or roadways with far fewer hands than earlier fantasies imagined. That physics, when paired with sedimentary evidence for short harbor basins and archaeologically attested sled tracks, completes a testable part of the season: quarry barge harbor sledge over wetted track placement on the platform. Midpoint payoff: the physical and documentary chain closes in a tangible artifact. The Khufu ship, a near-complete cedar vessel excavated by Kamal el-Malik in 1954 and reconstructed in museum records, demonstrates that Old Kingdom carpenters could build very large, seaworthy or riverine craft. The reconstructed length is about 43.4 m, confirming the logistical capacity implicit in Mirror's log. When you stitch that naval capability to the recorded circuits and the harbor architecture, the season's deliveries stop being hypothetical and become materially plausible movements carried out by named crews on repeatable timetables. But the season also leaves testable shadows. Non-invasive imaging, ScanPyramids muon radiography, later detects a large internal void above the Grand Gallery, an empirically robust feature whose function is unresolved. So while the external movement of stone can be reconstructed with high confidence from papyri, boats and bakeries, some internal constructional choices inside the monument remain open engineering problems that cannot be resolved by logistics alone. Future field tests: targeted coring to map submerged paleochannels, isotope matching of ship timbers to known cedar sources, microprovenance of casing stone benches, and constrained imaging campaigns aimed at the void, are the specific research steps that would convert the remaining uncertainties of the season into measured facts. Speculation: claims that attribute the season's results to lost global civilisations, extraterrestrial builders, or unknown physics do not withstand the documentary and material test. They omit Mirror's contemporaneous administrative logbook, ignore quarry inscriptions and ramp traces at extraction sites, and fail to account for experimentally measured hauling mechanics or the documented naval competence represented by the Khufu ship. Thus such alternatives are speculative and contradicted by primary evidence unless they can produce comparable contemporaneous records and material chains of custody. They push off before dawn, 40 men on a string of boats whose oars whisper while a low fire stokes the bakery ash back at the harbor, and the ledger mirror left behind reads like a manager's checklist rather than a myth. The Wadi al-Jarf Papyri, the Diary of Mirror, published and translated by Pierre Taulet, names Tura as the source of fine casing limestone, records repeated circuits between coastal storage galleries and a harbor tied to Giza, and in the best preserved fragments, lists crew counts 40, seasonal months often rendered July, November, and a cadence of 2 to 3 round trips every 10 days carrying clusters of dress blocks, administrative detail that ties specific people, places and material movements to Khufu's reign. At the river terminus the archaeology furnishes the human complements to those log lines. AERA's field program at Heit el-Ghurab, the so-called Lost City, or Workers' Town, has map-planned bakeries, magazines, ovens and long work gallery complexes whose scale and refuse deposits indicate mass provisioning on an organized schedule consistent with rotating labor contingents rather than a nameless slave horde. Faunal debris, bread ovens and domestic assemblages there were documented in multi-season reports and public syntheses by Mark Leiner and colleagues. The Khufu barque, excavated by Kamal el-Malik in 1954, conserved and published in museum records, and reconstructed as a near-complete cedar vessel approximately 43.4 m long, demonstrates that Old Kingdom shipwrights produced very large, seaworthy/riverine craft capable of heavy transport and complex joinery, providing a concrete, datable example of the naval capacity implicit in Mirror's itineraries. Quarry landscapes show the other half of the pipeline at source. Hatnub's alabaster quarries preserve in situ quarry graffiti, expedition inscriptions and the remains of engineered ramp systems, documented by the Hatnub Epigraphic Project and publications by March/Gurdon and colleagues, that testify to orchestrated extraction, local ramp and post-hauling techniques, and regional organization of large block removal long before stones were riverborne. Laboratory physics supplies the measurable mechanics the iconography hints at. Experiments published in Physical Review Letters, Fall et al., 2014, show that lightly wetting sand forms capillary bridges that increase sand stiffness and dramatically reduce sliding friction, an effect that makes hauling large sledges over-prepared. But it tracks quantitatively plausible and directly supports the Egyptian depictions of attendants pouring water in front of sledges. Geomorphology and sediment cores provide landscape proof for short harbor basins and paleo channels east of the plateau. Targeted coring and remote sensing reported in AERA and related paleohydrology studies recover buried silts and basin fills consistent with ephemeral canals and docking basins that could have brought barges within short hauling distance of Giza's eastern work galleries. Modern particle physics then added a non-textual witness inside the structure. ScanPyramids muon radiography teams, Morishima et al., 2017, independently detected a large internal, big void, above the Grand Gallery, an empirically robust cavity, minimum length 30 m as reported, whose detection is agreed by 3 different muon technologies, though its function, relieving space, construction gap, ritual corridor, remains interpretively open because direct access would risk damage to the monument. On the human side, osteological and cemetery evidence near Giza records repetitive load-bearing injuries, healed fractures and formal interments for individuals identified as craftsmen or foremen. Published field reports and syntheses, Leaner, Hawass and teams, describe named tomb owners, grave offerings and burial contexts consistent with a skilled, provisioned workforce rather than anonymous expendable units. Putting the season in ledger form. Specific mirror entries that list crew counts and routes, AERA's mapped bakeries and magazines that supply rotating teams, Hatnub's ramp inscriptions at quarry source, the Khufu barque showing naval capability, PRL measured wet sand mechanics that reduce sled drag, and paleo-channel cores that show harbor basins, yields a tightly cross-checked, sentence-by-sentence reconstruction. Quarrying and dressing at source loading onto large river/coastal craft transit. Time to Nile high water docking at short harbor basins east of Giza transfer to sledges on wetted tracks hauling to platform and placement. All overseen by named officials recorded in contemporary papyri. Remaining gaps are specific and technical rather than metaphysical. The ScanPyramids void's architectural role requires constrained imaging or highly controlled access to move from detection to function. Exact canal alignments and harbor engineering need denser coring transects and stratigraphic dating to tie sediment fills to Khufu's decades, and fine-scale provenance, isotopic or petrographic matching between Tura casing benches and surviving casing fragments would convert reasonable inference into concrete chain of custody statements. Each of these is a normal, tractable research task requiring further coring, microarchaeology and non-destructive imaging rather than speculative leaps. They are not stones alone but the ledger of a civilization written in limestone, the surviving administrative voice of Miras, diary, ties named crews and routes to Tura casing stone. The Heit el-Ghurab excavations reveal planned bakeries, magazines and worker housing that match large-scale provisioning. Quarry epigraphy at Hatnub and Aswan shows organized extraction at source. The Khufu barque proves riverine/naval capacity, and laboratory physics demonstrates a simple, measurable trick. Wetting sand that makes sled hauling far more efficient. Taken together, these cross-checked lines form a sober, human answer to who built the pyramids. Old Kingdom institutions using regional quarries, Nile/coastal logistics, skilled artisans and organized labor managed in seasons, not miracles. Local legend, in the villages that skirt Giza, elders still point to vanished inlets and tell of ancestors who lined the barges, or kept the ovens. Memories that have repeatedly guided coring and test trenches to buried silts and paleo basins. Oral fragments that have heuristic value for fieldwork but are corroborated only when matched to sediment cores and excavation data. Important puzzles remain and they are empirical, not mystical. Muon radiography, ScanPyramids, detected a large internal, big void, above the Grand Gallery, a robust, independently confirmed detection, but its architectural role is unresolved without methods that avoid damaging the monument. Likewise, detailed canal alignments, the exact season-by-season labor rosters, and one-to-one provenance links between particular Tura benches and surviving casing fragments require denser coring, isotopic/. petrographic matching and constrained imaging to convert plausible models into chain of custody facts. These are not excuses for speculation but a research agenda, targeted, measurable steps that will narrow uncertainty. Speculation, alternative claims invoking lost global civilizations, extraterrestrial builders, or hidden technologies fail to meet the documentary and material standards that undergird historical reconstruction. They do not supply contemporaneous administrative papyri, quarry-level epigraphy, conserved ship timbers, experimental mechanics, or coherent stratigraphic chains. So while such ideas are culturally resonant, mainstream scholarship treats them as unsupported hypotheses until they can produce comparable primary evidence. The human closing is simple. The pyramids stand as the product of managerial vision, skilled hands, seasonal labor, and solvable engineering, not as puzzles requiring the miraculous. Which precise canals carried the heaviest casing stones, who kept the logbooks at each transfer point, and what, exactly, lies within the muon-detected void? Those questions are invitations to coring, isotopic matching, constrained imaging and archival editing, not to surrender history to legend. Will you join the careful work of turning the pyramid's remaining blanks into dated chapters of documentary and material record?